Good morning and welcome to this session. I'm delighted to be here in conversation with two authors of two remarkable books. Both are books that tell stories that just seem to be waiting to be told. They're stories of rulers who ruled kingdoms that occupy the margins of history, of geography, of popular consciousness. And I can see that some music has begun to set the tone. So, we're already transported to a moment in history that we're going to be talking about. What's interesting about these books is both of them are about rulers who are audacious, who were startlingly self-assured, who seem to navigate very turbulent and challenging times with confidence and with creativity. On the one hand, we have Indira Viswanathan Peterson's biography of Serfoji II, the Maratha ruler of the 19th century Tanjore court. And on the other, we have this amazing yarn by Manu Pillai about a fascinating queen, Sethu Lakshmi Bai, of the court of Travancore in Kerala. So they're both going to be talking about their books at length, and the first question I think I'm going to just ask each of them to respond to is the question about how they stumbled upon these utterly fascinating stories that just seem to be waiting to be retrieved. Indira, I know that you describe yourself as a classicist, you're an academic, and I've read your Poems to Siva, which is a wonderful book. These are translations of the Nayanmar mystic poets, the Shaiva poets in Tamil. And it's clear that you've had a certain fascination with a particular area of literary history, but suddenly you seem to have found yourself, or you seem to have catapulted yourself to the 19th century. How did that happen?
That's a truly wonderful question. You placed me in the, that was a wonderful question, Arundhathi. You placed me in the Kaveri Delta region in the erstwhile kingdom of Thanjavur, formerly the Chola Empire's heartland, the rice bowl of South India, a place of nostalgia for people. I grew up in Bombay, now Mumbai, many, many years ago, and so I was a bicultural Maharashtrian, Hindi-speaking Tamil, displaced in a way, but at home in Bombay. So that is the reason that after doing English and Sanskrit for my higher degrees and working on literature, I decided that South India's cultural history and literature were very much neglected, particularly in the period after the 12th century. So I decided to, after the Poems to Siva, which is about the earlier time, between the 6th and the 8th, when the first Tamil great poems about the temples were written, I decided to go straight to the 16th and 17th centuries when the Nayakas came to Thanjavur. They came from the post-Vijayanagar warrior groups. And David Shulman and Narayana Rao had written a wonderful book about it, which was published around 1992. And at the same time, I decided that the Marathas, who ruled in Thanjavur, in this heartland, for 181 years, and created some of the sounds that you just heard. That was Thanjavur Bala Saraswati, the legendary dancer, dancing a Varnam composed by one of the court poets of Serfoji's court, and that this is the music and this is the dance and this is the canon that we South Indians grow up with and that we learn and so forth. And I decided that someone's got to write about this, but someone who also knows Marathi and that other side of culture. Let's not bother about how the Marathas came there. I started writing about the literature of the 17th century, and then when I realized that all of that was being crystallized at the court of Serfoji between 1798 and 1832, I decided that that would be the time which would be the place and the time that I would focus on. And I'll just say one more thing about it, which is that I was fascinated by Serfoji, because that's what you asked me about. I was fascinated by Serfoji because he came to so-called power in 1798, when just a year before Tipu Sultan had been defeated and all of South India and all of India had become British. His kingdom was taken away in 1799. He was left with just the city and the fort of Thanjavur. This is the kingdom. And he had accidentally received a European education, which he immediately put to amazing use, as I discovered. And the way I discovered it was that I used to go to the Saraswati Mahal Library, which some of you may know is actually called Tanjore Maharaja Serfoji Saraswati Mahal Library. His name is there. So I said, why is this called after him? Well, because he collected all these great ancient as well as contemporary manuscripts. It's one of the biggest Sanskrit and vernacular libraries in India. And then I had not known that he'd collected 4,500 books in all of the Enlightenment European disciplines, and that his big project was to modernize Thanjavur, but bring a modernity which would keep all these other things in conversation with this new vision that he had. That history has been forgotten. Thanjavur is just, that old place where you get Thanjavur paintings and everything is old-fashioned and everything is so ancient. No, it wasn't ancient. Almost everything was formed, the music, the dance, the literature, everything was formed in Serfoji's court between 1798 and 1832 and a little later. And most importantly, oral and performative forms, print culture, and all of these languages, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, Hindi, Sanskrit, all were playing, dancing in the Saraswati Mahal in this archive, and I wanted to bring them to life. I also wanted to bring Serfoji out of historical amnesia. He was a legend and a celebrity in his time, but he's a forgotten man now. So these were the two reasons. And the last bit is that there's a bit of nostalgia, I think, coming from Bombay, which is a multicultural, polyglot place. I wanted to remember a time when my South India, my roots, also was that kind of a place.
In fact, you invoke so many strains that touch a chord. I know that there was some of the very audience here that were there, people who were here 2 days ago for a conversation we did around Eating God, the book of Bhakti poetry. And I just wanted to say that Indira's translations of some of these Nayanmar poets have been a very integral part of that book, Eating God. So it feels like we're revisiting common terrain in the same space, and that has a certain significance. Manu, I don't know how many of you have already picked up this book. If not, you should. It's strange and fascinating story with court intrigue and simmering family feuds and sibling rivalry. And as I said, it seems to be a story that's just waiting to be told. My question is, how did you stumble upon it? And I read somewhere that you had actually chanced on the Maharani of Travancore's papers, private papers in 2009?
Yes, I did. It was a
How did that happen?
long journey, actually, but because Indira mentioned historical amnesia, I'll begin with that. Because when I was growing up, which was in the 1990s, there was this, the way history was taught was just this tedious affair, where it was one linear narrative that sort of, fell in place with the next. So first there were the Vedic Indians, how great they were, all you children clap. Then you come to the Guptas, again, golden age, wonderful, clap. Then you reach the Muslims and you're a little uncertain and you're like, okay, maybe not clap for everybody, clap for Akbar, not for Aurangzeb. Then you come to Shivaji and of course, now, things are again warming up and everyone's happy. And then finally the British, terrible. And then Gandhiji comes and then everything breaks into applause. Great, I mean, it all makes sense. The stories are all there and they deserve the attention that they have. But the problem is that at the end of the day, India is a mosaic of stories. It's not just one story. It's not just one linear narrative that spreads across the entire subcontinent. There's chapter after chapter. There's color, there's difference, there's patterns, there's, it's all a variety of stories that deserve to be told. And when you try to have these massive linear narratives, what happens is you end up choosing some and neglecting others. So a lot of the princely states, since you mentioned Serfoji, now the thing is, we were talking yesterday about how anybody who stood on the wrong side of history as officially a collaborator with the British, who wasn't a freedom fighter, gets written out of the grand narrative because they don't make sense anymore. They don't fit in that particular story. That's what happened with my character as well, Sethu Lakshmibai. She had this unusual situation where on the one hand, she was on the wrong side of history as someone in a princely state and so on. But on the other hand, even within the state, she didn't have the right support from the most powerful faction. She often ended up backing horses that weren't going to deliver her, let's say, a place in the eyes of posterity. It shouldn't have been like that, but for example, she supported Christians and the lower caste communities, which obviously meant that the upper caste Brahmins and the Nayars and the landed caste sort of were against her. They turned against her and sort of wrote her out or footnoted her into history. So I started going to Kerala. I was reading up about local history because I didn't grow up there. I grew up very close to Bombay and Pune. And I'd go there and I'd hear all these stories about, the local area, my own family. The most interesting thing was the matrilineal system. And then you hear about this queen, you hear about this story, and you discover, why is she not better known? This is a woman who at the age of 5 was installed as Maharani of Travancore. At 30, she becomes the actual ruler. She rules in her own right. She's the one who opens up education to women. She's the one, she dedicates a fifth of her revenues to education. We all talk about Kerala's literacy rate, but where did it begin? It wasn't, an overnight miracle that sort of happened after independence. There was a longer story to it. And Kerala in general, because we now live within these existing borders, we don't necessarily realize that culture is influenced by so many factors. So Kerala had more in common with Arabia than it had with the North. Delhi had more in common with Kabul than it had with Kerala. So these influences still exist there. There's a mosque that was being built in Kerala in the very lifetime of the Prophet. There's a mosque in Calicut called Mishkal Palli, which the Portuguese came and destroyed. And the Hindu Zamarin, a few decades later, when he triumphed over the Portuguese, he destroyed their fort, brought all the wood back and reconstructed the mosque. Because, these people had a completely different conception of, how things should be. These stories deserve to be told, I thought. It wasn't only about the freedom struggle. It wasn't only about who won which battle. And it wasn't only about pumping in more, fodder for an existing narrative. You had to discover gems of history that were forgotten. You had to resurrect memories of people who did contribute to history, but somehow, ended up on the wrong side, and therefore they were eclipsed.
But how did those private papers of the Maharani land up with you?
They didn't land up with me, actually. I got in touch with her granddaughter when I was about 19. Once I found her story, but I couldn't find anything more. So I emailed her granddaughter after I found her contact details, and she said, oh, I'm, surprised that someone your age wants to know about a woman who was born in the 19th century. So then they made everything accessible to me, her diaries, letters. I went and met them a bunch of times and, went on this whole trip across South India photographing Raja Ravi Verma's paintings because she was his granddaughter. And yeah, slowly started falling into place. I found a lot of material in London at the archives there. Intelligence reports that the British had on these families, on the royal families, and what they ate, whom they met, what time they went to sleep, how they slept, who they slept with, everything. And, slowly the pieces started falling into place. And then 6 years later, there was that book.
We'll come back to this. But I think what's interesting about both... What's interesting about both these books is that they speak not just of individuals, but as you've seen, they also speak of certain contexts, certain historical moments. And the two, both the individual and the moment, are inextricable in the way that they are presented in both these books. And what interested me is that as these invoke individuals and their times, they also extend and challenge our ideas of what it means to be traditional and what it means to be modern. So those ideas are constantly being interrogated. So in fact, I want to start by asking you, Indira, you talked right now about a Thanjavur that is cosmopolitan, that is polyglottal, that seems very culturally self-assured. dealing with cutting-edge ideas in science and so on. And this, as she pointed out, is at great variance with the Thanjavur that most of us grow up imagining, which is the seat of an ancient, unchanging, almost frozen culture. Was it part of the project for you to really challenge that? And I know that that was your area of fascination as you began, but was it also the project to challenge these ideas as you went along?
Yes, very much so, because what has happened after independence, of course, is, you remember that George Steiner in After Babel once very famously said, languages have become zones of silence and razor edges of division among people. And one of the things that happened to India was that linguistic states were formed. And once you do the linguistic states, and each state has its own language and so on, when I went to Bombay, I had to study Marathi, which I enjoyed, but it means that you can't study Tamil. These options simply weren't there, so we were more cut off from one another. And that's the pluralism that I was speaking about. It was never like that. There is a book by Lisa Mitchell where she points out that language was just a medium of communication and art and creativity and thought. It was not a marker of identity. And this was one of the things I really wanted to challenge. But along with language comes culture. And I just wanted to come back to what you said about tradition and modernity. This is where I have this, my book is called Serfoji II of Tanjore, Enlightenment and Princely Modernity in Colonial India. I wanted to bring in the idea that this was a colonial time, that this was not. Earlier revolutions and earlier innovations in Thanjavur had happened when there was no colonial overlord watching over the Tanjorean king. Serfoji was basically in a surveillance state. You mentioned who slept with whom, all of those things. More importantly, the problem was to find his voice. Where do you find that voice? Because he didn't write anything, no autobiography or any of those things. No Western style works were written about him, even though he received a European education. Most importantly, all his communication with anybody outside of Thanjavur or within Thanjavur in English had to be completely screened and censored, so that that voice isn't there. But the other voice, the other voices in plural, in all of these languages, Marathi, Hindi, Telugu, Tamil, whenever he saw something, he had something written or composed in all of those languages. There were dance dramas which were danced at both the temple and the court. And let me just give you that one example. The Kuravanji. Kuravanji is a Tamil word for Kurati, that is a nomadic tribal fortune teller, who comes into a town with her birdcatcher husband, and then they began to talk about the geography that they traveled through, the lands that they traveled through, the history of the local place, the history of the far-off places. Some of them have gone all the way to Delhi and China and Burma. So this is the early modern world of the Nayakas, when your Dutch are coming, all these people are coming, and these folk characters are dancing on the stage, singing these things. This is a very folksy thing. The Maratha court, already in the early 18th century, embraced this genre, and it became the most popular rage. It was like rap. It was the most important genre in Thanjavur. What does Serfoji do with it? You mentioned science. Now here, he takes this very traditional genre, which is very new in a way, and he has it danced both in the temple and at his court, and there are 2 or 3 different plays written along this theme. One of them praises Serfoji and his great deeds, which includes establishing it doesn't say this, but he established a printing press, he established schools. He was a first in many, many ways, and I'll mention those in just a minute. But let me finish about the Kuravanji. The other Kuravanji was for his schools, this drama. In what it did was to teach the modern terrestrial geography and Copernican astronomy through songs and dances in different Karnataka ragas and talas. And that book is still available in Thanjavur, so that you can see when Serfoji collected 2,500 books, out of which he had the biggest collection of geography and some of the best star atlases from Europe, some of them printed in 1742. he put them to very good use to disseminate this knowledge to his people. The thing I wanted to say about him was that he was personally completely engaged with the European Enlightenment, which is a very different path to relating to Europe, and not through colonial power. That is the first point I wanted to make. The second was he mastered both traditional Indic knowledge in Sanskrit and all of these other languages, as well as these European languages and European learning. Science was his passion, which is why we talked about science and astronomy. And he also thought that if I'm getting all this, then my people should get this too. So he established these schools, and here's the other example, which is that while people in Calcutta, the British government hadn't done anything about schooling for Indians, although Ram Mohan Roy was clamoring for schools in 1823, the Calcutta citizens had already established an English and multi-language school in Calcutta, the Calcutta School Society, in 1817. Serfoji had established schools, modern schools for English, 4 other languages, and Sanskrit in an almshouse where any poor person, traveler could come. People could board and they could get a free education before anybody else other than the missionaries had established any schools. So this is his notion of modernity, and this is what I wanted to say. Tradition for Serfoji was being an Indian king who was a palaka, a guardian and protector of his people. This is Raja Dharma, the duties or the obligations of a king. And that duty didn't mean preserving old Sanskrit manuscripts in a musty library. It meant all these other things, that Indic idioms and local idioms of kingship and power and fame and royalty could be purveyed from this tiny little kingdom, and his name would go far and wide. Indeed, the British were so impressed with him, he was written up in the Asiatic Register, the Gentleman's Magazine, and he was made the first foreign member of the Royal Asiatic Society in 1824, because he was also a person who preserved all of these Sanskrit manuscripts for posterity in the Saraswati Mahal. One trip to Banaras, the only trip he ever made out of Thanjavur, was in 1820 to 21. He brought 5,000 rare manuscripts in all fields of Indic sciences, including, and in Thanjavur you have Gaja Shastra, elephant science, veterinary medicine, and eventually I'll say something about Siddha Vaidya, but I don't want to dominate. So.
We'll actually come back to the individual. No, there's a lot we'll come back to this, the figure that Serfoji presents in the course of this biography. But Manu, that's also the question I wanted to ask you about context, because you talk about a context that is matrilineal, that is culturally complex, sophisticated, again, challenging or extending grand narratives about history, gender, culture. Tell us more about that. Was that also something that fired you from the start, or was it the individual? What was your starting point?
It was also the context, because it was so unlike anything we taught about, anything that's even spoken about anymore. One of my favorite stories, and I always repeat it whenever I get a platform, is about the Irish Malayali author Aubrey Menon. So his father was a Menon from Kerala, his mother was a white woman. And then when the mother and father got married, the mother came to Kerala to meet her mother-in-law. And then at one point, the mother-in-law sent a maid to sort of invite this European daughter-in-law to come see her. And then the maid came back running saying, Ayyo, this lady's come from there and she's sitting with her breasts covered. The mother-in-law said, oh, if she's covering her breasts, then she must be preparing for adultery. Because in Kerala, till as late as the 1940s and 50s, many women went about topless. And this was just a rule across the board. Among the first Brahmin women to wear a blouse in the 1920s, they were excommunicated. One social reformer, went off to Madras, got a new education and so on, and he came back saying, I'm going to make women chaste. So he pulled out a procession of Nayar women in Thrissur. And he said, now, you must all wear blouses because toplessness is a bad thing, it's immoral, and you must all walk the streets so that the blouse gets a respectable status in our society. And they did. They started this procession, but such were the crowds that came to see the spectacle of women wearing blouses that these women got very embarrassed, and in the middle of the procession, they took it off and threw it away because they didn't want that sort of attention. The idea was that if you felt the need to cover yourself above the waist, then there was something wrong with you because you were sexualizing the body in a way that people there were not used to doing. And this was something that lasted down the ages. In the early 17th century, there was an Italian traveler who came to the court of the Zamorin of Calicut. And he was surprised because he saw two little princesses, about 13 or 14 or 12, coming into the courtroom. And they had just had a little loincloth of, very rich silk and lots of jewels, but they weren't wearing anything above the waist. So he was mystified by these, creations in front of him. And they were mystified with him because they were wondering why he was all decked up with a cloak and velvet and this and that. So they went near him, they started pinching him and touching his clothes and wondering what was wrong with him and why he was dressed like this. So, these are not stories you hear anymore. Now, the matrilineal system also. Now, since my protagonist is Sethu Lakshmibai, she was not a Maharani because she was married to a Maharaja. In fact, when she ruled, her title was Maharaja because your gender didn't matter when you ruled, the title was the same. So her husband was only called the consort. And she, at the age of 10, was asked to look out of the window. A bunch of boys were presented, 2 in her case. Her sister had 5 options. And she was asked, you can pick whichever one you like, and that's going to be your husband. These husbands could only go to their wives' bedrooms when they were invited, when the stars were auspicious. They couldn't stay in the same palace. They couldn't refer to their wives by name. They had to call their wives your highnesses. They couldn't travel in the same car or carriage with their wives because that would signify equality. And if by some breach of protocol they ended up in the same car, they had to sit opposite but never next to their wives. In the presence of a third person, they couldn't take a seat. When there were banquets in the palace, the Maharani was served 4 desserts, her husband was served 2. In every respect, it was dinned into these people that in this system, a husband does not matter. To the extent that even now, in my family, when we do rituals, if, say, my father were to pass away in due course, I do not actually have to do the rituals. It would be his sister's son who would do the rituals. Correct. In the royal family, when a husband was on his deathbed, the entire court would be lifted and taken away from the palace because the Maharani's husband had no business dying in the palace because he was not a member of the royal family. The kids, his own kids and wife never even attended his funeral because they were royalty. He may have married into royalty, but he was also still their subject. So there were these peculiar rules about everything, and it's so topsy-turvy if we look at it now. But in their generation, it was perfectly normal. It was perfectly fine. My great-great-grandmother in the 1880s, she was a pious woman, a Sanskrit scholar, all of that. She married a Brahmin first. The marriage broke down. And then she married a second man. My great-great-grandfather had a first wife of his own and a son from that marriage. He abandoned them and married her. Their son had 4 wives before he finally settled on one. Their sister also married twice. These things are perfectly normal in Kerala of the day. And it's just that as the 20th century made its way, a number of patriarchal notions from the north, from the west, a sort of Victorian morality that was born in the 19th century, all of it made its way into Kerala. And suddenly you have women's magazines springing up saying, we will never publish anything about politics. We will publish stories that energize the moral conscience, which is what? Be a good wife, be a good mother, only one husband, wear a blouse, things like that. And and it's built up so much that now in Kerala, if you go for an Naya wedding, there's something, the sindoor, which didn't exist there. No. All we had for a ritual was that man gave the woman a cloth. If she tore the cloth and threw it in his face, the marriage was off. And as long as she kept it with her, the marriage was on. It was as easy as that. But these things change very quickly. And now if you ask someone what Kerala tradition is, they'll think it was all pattisaris and, the sinduram and all of that. It wasn't like that. Only about 100 years ago, it was a very different universe. And what it also teaches you is that how quickly things can change. How quickly we can form impressions about what was traditional, what was always there, what was timeless. Nothing was timeless. Things were always being influenced by other things. And, that context made it supremely fascinating. And I found the perfect character for it because she was royalty. And the stories around her were equally gripping. Yeah.
Yes. In fact, I remember you saying... I remember you saying in an interview that, when we grow up reading textbooks that talk in these vast generalities about the plight of Indian women, and reading that and then going back home and hearing such markedly divergent narratives, I think most of us grow up with playing this strange game of trying to straddle these multiple realities that we inhabit, and that seems to be much of what growing up in India is about, isn't it? So coming back then to Serfoji, because I know that Indira also has visuals that she would like to share with us.
I can do it very quickly, but
yes.
I have some thoughts in response to this. Yes. But if
why don't you share the thoughts before we move on?
It's going back to your question about context, which I didn't really answer. What I wanted to say was that right now we live in an era where we are excited about everything new. And this is part of this reflexivity of modernity. And Eisenstadt and others have shown that there's not one European modernity. In India, we make whatever kind of modernity we want. In America, it's something else. And every place is different. In Texas, it's different. In Massachusetts, it's different. In Punjab, it's different. And this is one of the things I wanted to establish in my book about Serfoji, was about the context as well. For example, you all know that the violin is the standard accompanying instrument in Carnatic music. Where did the violin come from? Europe. It came from these fiddle tunes that the soldiers were playing, on the streets of Thanjavur. They were in the garrison, which was there during the Tipu and Mysore wars. And so all of the musicians in Thanjavur went gaga about this, and the violin actually traveled to Travancore because the Travancoreans had heard about it, and they said, we want this violin, So Vadivelu, the dance master of the Tanjore Quartet, who created the most beautiful, and I'll sing a line of one of their varnams that Bala Saraswati was dancing. Anyway, the violin goes there, and the violin is the biggest craze, and it becomes the instrument. I have an image there where there is Krishna, the fat Thanjavur gilded painting Krishna, and surrounding him there is a king who's worshipping him, and there are two women, one is playing a tanpura, the other is playing the violin standing. So they were playing it the European way, and now we sit and play it the South Indian way. So here's a very good example. What was going on was that not Serfoji alone, but he had an entire population which was excited about the coming of new forms of thinking, new forms of information, new forms of knowledge. Serfoji was just ahead of everyone. He was first because he had this very deep understanding of the European Enlightenment. Another example, chemistry was a new science in 1800. Serfoji imported electrical machines and air pumps, and he performed chemical experiments exactly at the same time where gentlemen scientists were doing it in Europe. So I want to talk about I want to establish the contemporaneity of these kinds of modernities. And his modernity, I call it princely modernity, because he had the wherewithal and the vision to create something which went far beyond himself. I'll give one last example, is his translation of Aesop. First, he established a press. All of these things were done in 1800. The moment he was thrown out and become, the king of just, a moat fort and a city, he orders a printing press, and for Devanagari, for Sanskrit and Marathi, and publishes the first Sanskrit classics in print. And he also prints the Amarakosha, which is the pedagogic book for studying Sanskrit, the first book. At the same time, he prints the Aesop's fables in the first Indian or any Asian translation, the entire Aesop's fables with woodcuts and everything, and he puts them in the same schools together for these children so they can learn both of these kinds of things. The Amarakosha cultivates memory. It's a memory mnemonic pedagogy. He didn't ditch it. He said, this is very useful. In the dance drama where they were studying geography, they were memorizing the planets, the continents, and so on. Memory has a place, not rote memory, but learning memory. And at the same time, Aesop and print culture would enable you to read the alphabet and write and get into to accessing knowledge on your own without a teacher. These were the two kinds of things that he was juxtaposing. The excitement that I wanted to mention was that, let's take the dance masters. The dance masters would create all these new forms every day, as it were, and they became the craze in Carnatic music. One form is the Tillana. Many of you may know that. Tillana is probably the Tarana, the North Indian form, but in the Maratha court, it became the perfect South Indian form. Another form was the Varnam, a quintessential South Indian form. That's what she was dancing, and I can sing that. Sa mi ni ra ma ve sa ki sa. Such lyricism. She says, oh. Thank you. She's saying, the lady is saying, oh friend, Sakhi, Please go bring my lover to me. Sami ni Ramanave. This is by the Tanjore Quartet. They are incredible. They did 5 major varnams, which everybody of the great dancers like Bala Saraswati danced, and which are still the toughest things to ever learn. To learn this one line, I had to practice 200 times just to get it right. But then, he gets one of his great Tamil scholarly court poets from a Shaiva monastic establishment to write a Kuravanji drama to play at the temple. And the Kuravanji comes and saying, would you buy a tattoo from me? Can I tell your fortune? And she speaks 5 languages. Ek Hindustani lady aake mujhe pucha, mere haath dekkar bathana. She says this in Hindi. Then a Tamil maad urti vandal en kaye par endru sonnal. Oru Telugu manini ange nanni in cheyi chudu eni cheppi. So, she's speaking all these languages, and she's a kind of what the culture was like. So, and this is how she comes, describing the hills. Vanarangal kani koduthu mandiyodu konjum mandi sindu kanigalukku vaankavigal kenjum தானவர்கள் விழியறிந்து வானவரை அழைப்பார் கமனசித்தார் வந்து வந்து காயசித்தி விளைப்பார். And so it goes. But I think I've made my point. And I'll just show the PowerPoint just so that you can get a sense of the juxtaposition Serfoji was making, and then I'm sure Manu will have more to say. So could you show the PowerPoint, please? We'll just
Manu has a question.
Very melodiously made point. But no, your point on princely modernity, that got me thinking about even Tipu Sultan, leaving aside his brutal wars and so on. At one point he had this idea that he wanted to send his sons to France.
He did.
And it was the French Revolution that upset those plans. He was importing technology from there, building rockets from there. In the early 19th century, another fascinating story is about a bunch of Devadasis from Pondicherry who get on a French boat and they go to Paris and they go to perform before the French, the king. After
and
the
there was a sculpture made for them, and Gautier
and they went to London,
about
to Frankfurt, and a whole
Yeah.
series of places.
Yeah.
And you keep thinking that, there's this general statement that's often made that the British brought modernity to India, whereas in reality, where there were autonomous sources
Indians
of power,
were
they were
making
attracting
modernity.
the forces of modernity anyway.
Precisely.
And they were specially sort of recrafting it and refashioning it
Multiple
in an Indian
modernities.
context and an Indian idiom, which is
modernities.
remarkable.
Yes. So, could we just quickly do this?
Absolutely. I think it's
Manu to
begun.
speak because
No,
I don't want to
it's
take more
begun.
time. Basically, what you're seeing is images. Can you see them? They can see them. Okay. Could you, next slide, please? You'll just see them. Serfoji, next slide, please. Painting of Serfoji. Next slide, please. This is where Thanjavur is. Next slide, please. And this is a map I made of all the things that he sent to Europe and that he received from Europe. 4,500 books, a printing press, sculptures by the neoclassical sculptor Flaxman came from London. His portrait and natural history paintings went to Copenhagen, Halle, Germany. The missionaries he studied with were German, so he had contacts with Denmark, Germany, and England, so that England wasn't just his horizon. Next slide, please. Next. He rebuilt the entire, not the entire, but major shrine that Rajaraja Chola had built in 1010 AD. It had served as a garrison for 25 years, and Serfoji rebuilt it, and he created all this music and all this dance, and became a rocking place, which it remains to this day. It's a UNESCO national monument, UNESCO heritage monument, and it's thanks to Serfoji. Next one, please. Many languages I've already mentioned. We can just go through this. Next. 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 Palm leaf manuscripts. Next. Marathi. Rig Veda. Next. Bala Saraswati dancing. Next. Devadasis dancing the Kuravanji drama at the temple. Next. More women dancing the Kuravanji. Fortune telling. Next, please. Violin and Krishna. Next. Next. You can just skip it and keep going. Keep going, please. Keep going. Just mentioned his 2 libraries, that's all. And his great almshouse was like a palace. He had schools there, and everyone could get a free education there in 1800 to 1832 and beyond. Next, please. Aesop's Fables in Marathi, the first printed version. Next, please. Serfoji's statue by Flaxman. Next. 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 Just want to pause a little bit on the next few slides. Next one, please. Next one. These are the armillary spheres and globes of the kind that he ordered from Germany and England. Next, please. His star atlas, 1742. Next, please. Geography from his collection. Next, please. I have a text there. The Indrani, Queen of Heaven, is asking the fortune teller. She's saying, tell me, where do you come from? What is the diameter of the Earth's sphere? And how far, what is the distance between the planets and the sun? Does the sun revolve around the Earth, or does the Earth revolve around the sun? Please tell me, please tell me. And Indrani is this lovelorn lady whose fortune is going to be told by this Kuravanji. Instead, they're sitting here and talking about geography and astronomy, which is rather fun. Next, please. Almost done. Next. Just a few slides. These are Serfoji's own natural history field notes. He sent his natural history notes about tigers, elephants, and other things to England, and they are still at the British Library. So he observed both hawking and hunting, which were the royal pastimes, and he had pictures made of them, but he also did this. I think we can stop there so that we can continue speaking.
Are there more?
A couple of slides, but
Just
I don't want
finish
to.
them.
Okay, yeah, let's keep going. Let's keep playing. Gajashastra, falcons. Next, please. Shama in Serfoji's handwriting, a bird that he's described in the Linnaean taxonomy. The next one, please. I don't want to go into this. Next one, please. Actually, could we go back to that slide? That one, please. That is something I want to mention very quickly. The Siddha Vaidya, the Unani Arabic system, and the Ayurvedic system are the three major systems of Indian medicine. Serfoji studied allopathic Western medicine seriously for 3 years, but at the same time he ordered 18 volumes of Tamil poems to be written, synthesizing the Siddha, Ayurveda, and Unani systems all in Tamil, so they could be sung just the way I was singing and could be memorized. So you see, in medicine, again, he was a synthesizer. The last two images, please. Those images are my sources, which are inaccessible to me. They are, Mr. Kulkarni and others who are here will know, Modi is a script of Marathi which was used for all writing, and that is no longer used by anybody now. You have to study, take a special course. I have done that, but my problem is that there are 950 bundles of palace records which are inaccessible to us because they have not been opened, they have not been catalogued, and they're all completely chronologically mixed up.
These seem, when one reads these books, these are about individuals who seem to hold ostensible contradictions in harmony. And that's also, of course, a tribute to good storytelling. And I think that's what comes through time and again in this particular book by Manu. The sense of this woman, she becomes intensely real as you read about her. She's negotiating very complex times, but comes up with a complex response to complex times. So there is this woman who is formidable, who's sartorially very conservative, but who still seems to be pro-reform, pro-women, pro-education. Tell us more.
Well, her work was, she only ruled for about 7 years, but in those 7 years, yes, precisely because she was aware that she had a very limited tenure as, regent before her nephew grew up. And this is a nephew from a sister who doesn't like her. So there's that sort of politics happening as well between them. So in those 7 years, she packs in a whole bunch of things. She's dealing with Gandhi, Mussolini's daughter. There's a Tagore who shows up. She's building roads, she's building schools. And she has this interesting custom where she doesn't live in the palace. Now, the way this royal family works is, as a new dynasty sort of establishes itself over a new territory, Now, legitimization doesn't merely come from the exercise of power. You also need to be seen as powerful. You also need to be seen as unique. So in her family, in her life itself, there was a 12-volume palace manual that guided everything she did. So what time you woke up, in which position you slumbered, how you ate, what you ate, everything was written down. So if she wanted to take a walk in the garden at 4 o'clock, there'd be 2 household guards in front, 2 with these uniformed on either side and 2 at the back. And then she had 8 maidservants and they'd all follow her. So for this one woman to go for a walk, there were 16 or 17 people going behind her like there's someone holding up a parasol and all of that. There was no privacy, nothing. So, I mean, other than her political work, other than the accomplishments as an administrator, which were of the highest order, what really struck me was that at the age of 61, she gives it all up. She lives in palaces surrounded by 300 servants. And then this woman, in 1947, there's independence, and she's only in her early 50s. In 1956, as you know, Kerala elects the world's first elected state government, the commies, who are now in power. And suddenly her palace servants form a union, and they're all shouting slogans in the palace, and she doesn't have anybody in her kitchen and all of that. And then she realizes, what am I doing here? The tides turned, I need to now move with the times. And this is someone, as I said, she was queen from the age of 5. From the age of 5, anytime she walked into a room, people stood up and bowed. That was the life she was accustomed to. And this woman gets on a train and gets off to Madras and then eventually settles down in Bangalore, where she's become a complete nobody. She doesn't stir, she just wants to live in her house surrounded by a small rose garden. And over time, the palaces go, because the communist government's acquiring them, so her summer palace becomes an agriculture university, her official residence becomes a medical research facility, her beach palace becomes a tourist spot. One by one, everything is taken away from her. And she doesn't even come back to Kerala for the last 30 years of her life. And having ruled, her family's ruled here for 1,000 years. And she slowly sort of fades away, becomes an absolute nobody. And at the end of it all, this is a woman who, as I said, there were 16 servants for a walk, and when she dies, she's cremated in this electric crematorium in a queue of other bodies that, there's someone else's grandmother, and there she is as well in that line. And the story ends it's tragic, but it's also the way in which she handled it all with great dignity. And then the next generation of the family is even more interesting because she had a daughter. And this daughter comes out of the palace, and when she first comes to Bangalore, she says, okay, I'm going to start driving my own car, cooking in my own kitchen. And she says, I'm going to go shopping. So she goes into Malleshwaram market and she sees vegetables for the first time in their raw state. And then she picks up a bunch of things at the Bangalore club. They had a shop there. And then she goes to the lady at the till, and the lady says, madam, that will be 80 rupees. This is 1949. And this woman has no conception of what a rupee is because she's never had to deal with money. And from there, this family sort of transforms itself. And watching over all of this is this woman who, in a different lifetime, was a queen, but who, by the end of her life, all she had was a bed and a trunk full of her letters under that bed. And there's nothing else left. Even her house had to be cut up into pieces because the Urban Land Ceiling Act said a bungalow could not exceed more than 15,000 square feet. And she lived in a 3-acre property. So her gardens were chopped up, given to various people. Her house was so large at that time that one wing went to one granddaughter, the kitchen wing went to another granddaughter, and the wing in which she stayed went to a third granddaughter. Like, everything was taken away from her one by one. And she took it all with grace, and she faded away because she realized that her role in history was over.
Manu, I just wanted to say that this is so amazing that you were able to go all the way from Sethu Lakshmi Bai to the division of land. This is an extraordinary feat of historical scholarship, and you should get all the applause. That's just amazing. Thank you.
Manu, this is also such recent history that I wondered what the whole journey was like making a book like this. What has the response to it been, from the family? Have there been family members who snubbed you, stonewalled you? Have you returned to Kerala? What has happened?
Well, if you've looked at the cover of the book, the photograph that was on display earlier, there's 2 women in it. So Sethu Lakshmi Bai leaves, her family leaves. One of her great-grandsons is a dentist, another lives in Vietnam, another's in Germany. They've all spread out over the world. They have no connection with Kerala. They have no palaces, nothing. Sethu Parvati Bai's branch still lives in Trivandrum. They still have a splendid palace where they live. People still treat them as royalty and so on. That branch of the family did not cooperate with me for my book. Over 6 years, multiple times I did try to reach out, but they said, no, you're here to slander and sort of scandalize and sort of create a sensational book. Because I was transparent in my approach. I said that the records are not always flattering, because the records are what they are. You can build a narrative, but the historian's job is to investigate and question existing narratives that there are, and breaking it down and saying, this might not have been what it seems to be. And that sort of thing didn't appeal to a number of members of the family. Sethu Lakshmi Bai's family, because they moved on, they're not particularly hung up over their ex-royal status, so that was much more easy to find. I found a whole treasure trove, I don't normally use that expression, but I found a treasure trove of records in the British archives. It's just staggering material from the 17th century, land records, grants given to the English factors at Anjengo. Fascinating material. There's this great Malayali poet, he's a member of this family, married into it, and he's a great Sanskrit scholar, Kerala Varma in the 19th century. He was called the Kerala Kalidas. And I found this 1877 letter that he wrote when he was briefly out of favor with the then Raja. And he says, yes, I admit to my sins and my crimes. And his crimes are an attraction to Christianity, an interest in marijuana, corresponding with journalists. And you realize this man was 20-something then, and he did the same things that kids now go on to do, right? And it's just, like, the parallels are so fascinating. We tend to turn historical figures into gods. But they had all our flaws, they had all our weaknesses. They fell into the same traps that we go and jump into deliberately and in full awareness that it's a trap. It's just a pattern of life, right? So it was that as well. It was the fact that these were great historical figures, but at the end of the day, they were just, men and women in the flesh, men and women who were mortals, and they deserved to be treated as great men and great women, not as great gods.
Could I just one more? Yeah, first let's give him a hand. But I just wanted to know, see, this is one of the issues, is that first, yesterday we talked about Sethu Lakshmi Bai, and I told you that some family members of mine from Nagarkoil worship her because, not worship her like a goddess, but their schools are named after her. She's a remarkable figure. She's remembered only outside of Kerala. That's what's interesting. When Travancore state was broken up and Nagarkoil went to Tamil Nadu, they remember her. But what I wanted to ask you was, and we can talk about it later if you like, was this whole business of the British archives. And my problem is that I mentioned these bundles of records which are not accessible. And I can talk about this again maybe when you ask a question, but the way I had to write this history was entirely through the artifacts and the productions of Serfoji's life and his court, rather than that many written documents, because the British Archive concerned themselves only with the political dealings and military, not military because there wasn't anything military, largely with political dealings with Serfoji, so that, and there was this surveillance, so that Serfoji never really spoke in his own voice. And I have envy for you, this recent history where you have people who can talk about, oh, they were like that, and they can give you some sense
Diaries.
of that. So that's
Anecdote
great. That's
as
all I
well.
wanted to
That's
say.
possible. I know that I have questions, but I've also found that many unanswered questions have been addressed. So if that's happened to some of you, perhaps you don't want to share your questions, but those that do, this is the time for it. We have about 7 minutes. Yes. Would the mic go there?
Hello. Could I ask one question? In the remaining old noble families of Kerala,
I can't see.
of the remaining old or noble families of Kerala Trivandrum, is there any remaining matrilineal sense of inheritance, or has that tradition completely gone, or does it remain?
It doesn't exist legally. Ironically, it was Sethu Lakshmi Bai who abolished the system legally, but it does exist in families. For example, my own mother, because she's a daughter, she's inherited 2 houses from her mother, whereas my father, because he's a son, has inherited a little hole in the ground in the middle of nowhere that none of his sisters want, because that's still how it works out. And we as a family, for example, we still often, for example, father's mother is always called father's mother. The word for grandmother didn't exist at one time for father's mother. Whereas mother's mother is the grandmother. That's the one you have a bond with. So we always stay with my mother's family. We always attend rituals in my mother's family. We don't necessarily have very many dealings with my father's family, other than, occasionally meeting them and that sort of thing. So it exists. It varies from region to region. In the northern parts, there are still joint families, a handful. In the south, where I come from, it's different, but property often is inherited in a sense where the daughters get a greater share. So even if the 2 houses that my mother has, my sister gets the big house, I get the small house.
Yes.
Excuse me. Morning. Just as a displaced Malayali myself, like what Indira said, this question is for you, Manu. Just wanted to ask you about, this doesn't really relate to Sethu Lakshmi Bai. However, the fact about Illinois being the commander-in-chief of Marthanda Varma's, his army. And the fact that he served for 35 to 40 years with the Travancore dynasty when he could have easily gone away later. Why was that? That's that's something I would really like to know.
This was a Dutch prisoner of war who became a general in the Travancore army and served for decades. But that's not an unusual story. So my next book, which comes out in June, is about a history of the Deccan. And everyone makes a Deccan about Shivaji, for example, the rise of the Marathas. But before Shivaji, there were Persian kings, first generation immigrants who came to the Deccan and overnight transformed themselves as kings. They ruled there, they established dynasties there. There were Africans who came in the thousands. Malik Ambar was this great general there. One of his daughters married a king. So in the early 17th century, there was an African queen ruling from Ahmednagar. Her husband was ruling, but actually her father. But anyway, she was an African queen, technically speaking. So the presence of foreigners and mercenaries, etc., was not all that surprising. Tipu had people in his armies. Gohar Jan, the great wife of the late 19th century, she had an Armenian grandfather and a German grandfather also, I think. Begum Samru, she was part, I think, Georgian. Yes, and her husband was German. So the coming and going of foreigners wasn't such an unusual thing at that time. It's just that because these stories have not been given the attention they deserve, they often when we come across one story, we sort of sit up and say, how fascinating. But in reality, it was very common in those days to have people coming over like this and serving in Indian courts.
Yes, very quickly, another question, yes.
So, ma'am, you spoke about the violin, about how it was this excitement about something new. And you kind of built this thing of Serfoji. Sorry.
Could you speak closer to the mic? I couldn't hear that.
You spoke about the violin and how it was an excitement of something new. And you also built this fascination of Serfoji, of how he was modern for his times. And you said that Setu Lakshmi Bai, she kind of turned with the tides as the tide turned. So my question is, how do we deal with the excitement about the new as well as the nostalgia for the old?
Good question. Yeah.
Very good.
Reading books like Indira's.
One sentence. Sorry?
Reading books like yours.
Yes, well, that's a very good answer, and yours too. Yes, nostalgia, I think, is perfectly all right. I have it, I think I admitted it right away. The one reason I wrote the book was, but nostalgia for the unknown, for the unremembered, as it were, it is discovering. So for me, it was new. For me to go to Saraswati Mahal expecting thousands of Sanskrit manuscripts as a Sanskrit professor and wanting to, by the way, I'm very involved in performing arts, and this was the greatest context of Thanjavur. Everything was done in performance, and that is something we still have. And that's what I wanted to say yesterday when we were talking about translations in English, and it's a dead end because only certain people can read them, and then how is it going to get to anybody? Well, somebody could do a drama, somebody could do a dance, somebody could create a film. These are all things that speak to everybody, and in India, we have oral traditions which are still alive in all of these ways. So to me, that nostalgia, that part of the nostalgia of connecting with that was incredibly wonderful, but so was holding Alexander von Humboldt's 1815 volume of his travels in South America in my hand, signed by Serfoji. 4,500 books. Over 20 years, I've touched them all. This was an incredible connection.
Yes, Manu.
Oh, well, sorry, I think I have more questions though.
No, I think...
Burning, oh my God, there are 5, 7, maybe. Okay, so shall we just do about 3 very quickly articulated questions, and then we can, yes.
More female voices.
Yes, absolutely, right here.
I've got them.
Yeah.
So my question is for Sundrani. Yes. So you said Serfoji opened up his almhouse for education.
Closer to the mic.
Yeah, so you said Serfoji opened up his almhouse for education. So was it education for everyone, or was there a caste barrier?
Yes, there was education for everyone. Oh, sorry, 3 questions.
No.
I'll wait.
As the mic travels, you can answer.
Okay. The education was for everyone. Orphans, that is people with no mother or father, could come to the almshouse and be boarders and get a full education there and then go out and get a job. This was the first employment opportunity that anybody ever got. One of my ancestors wasn't an orphan, but lived as a boarder, and we were poor Brahmin family, and he came up in the world because of that. I'm where I am today because of Serfoji.
All right, so my questions to...
Yes.
Hello. Alright, so my question's to Manu sir. So I'm originally from Kerala and I'm currently studying in Delhi. So something very fascinating that I found when you were talking is the idea of how Kerala was a matriarchal society in and of itself, right? Something I find in debate rooms around the country is that when we discuss feminism, people think of this paradigm where the feminist movement is succeeded and the society is matriarchal and the patriarchs start protesting, right? But the interesting fact is that that already existed in the 1940s. So where do you think this legacy of Kerala and the ideas that we believed in got faded away in history when you go out and represent India?
It's not entirely faded away in the sense that, look at this, there was a report recently said, rapes highest in Kerala. Actually, no, rapes are reported in Kerala because women will still talk. Divorce rates highest in Kerala because if you beat your wife, she will go and she will throw you out of the door. You know, so a legal framework has gone, and it was never matriarchal by the way, it was matrilineal. But some of that cultural sort of residue remains, and it's a very, very strong legacy that we have. We've run out of time otherwise, but I'll speak to you in private because they've got the next session now.
I know there are several questions here, and I think both of them would be very happy to answer these
Very
questions.
happy to answer them. We
Just
could go outside
so that
and
we
I'm
don't
happy
spill
to
into the
speak.
next section.
Thank you very
Thank you, Indira. Thank you, Manu. Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this interest.